The laughter was cruel, sharp metallic, and echoing off the glass walls of the Miratech Grand Atrium like arrows themselves. Somewhere near the stage, someone whispered, "Let the janitor have a go. What's the worst that could happen?" A ripple of snickers followed. Richard Kane stood still, mop still dripping in one hand, a bow, polished ceremonial untouched for years in the other. The spotlight found him exposing every wrinkle in his old Navy-issued shirt and every gray strand in his long, tied-back hair. Across the gala, crystal glasses froze mid-air. A string quartet fell into silence. On a massive LED display above the target lit up 60 feet away, no guides, no wind correction, and no mercy. He raised the bow, drew back. The room laughed harder, then silence. Thwack. One arrow, one breath, one perfect impossible shot. Dead center. A gasp broke from the crowd like a sudden intake of shared breath. Phones lifted, eyes widened. But one face didn't move, didn't blink. Brielle Maddox. Miratech's iron-willed CEO stood rooted, lips parted. Her mascara barely held back tears, as something inside her cracked like old wood under pressure. She wasn't crying because the janitor hit the bullseye. She was crying because she knew what it cost him. If you've ever underestimated someone, or been the one they all laughed at, this story is for you. Keep reading. The arrow has only just left the string. Richard didn't bow, didn't smile, didn't even look at the target again. He handed the bow back to the wide-eyed intern who had dared him, nodded politely, and turned toward the service corridor. The applause started late hesitant, like the crowd wasn't sure whether to be embarrassed or amazed. He vanished into the staff hallway before anyone could stop him. Brielle hadn't moved. Her champagne flute hung forgotten in her hand, untouched since the toast. Her mind played and replayed the sound of that shot, not the impact, but the moment before. That steady breath, that complete stillness. He wasn't just lucky, he was trained. And not just trained, he was once great. She could see it in the way he handled the bow, how he lined up the shot without flinching, how he didn't look surprised when the arrow landed. She had been a competitive archer in college. She knew what mastery looked like. And that was not a fluke. Behind the stage, Richard took off the mop apron and folded it neatly. His hands still smelled faintly of bleach and metal polish. He took a quiet breath, then pulled a small leather pouch from his backpack, a pouch he hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Inside was a single arrowhead, chipped, rusted, blackened at the edges. It wasn't for shooting. It was a reminder of the last time he held a bow in public, of the last time he aimed at something that didn't deserve it. He placed it back inside, zipped the pouch closed. Then he looked up right into the eyes of his daughter Lena, who had been waiting by the janitor's closet. She couldn't have been prouder. "Did you hit it?" she whispered, wide-eyed. Richard smiled softly. Bullseye. Her grin lit up the hallway. Upstairs, in a private lounge overlooking the gala floor, Brielle finally turned to Miles, the head of security, her old classmate from West Point, and the only man in the building who might have known something. "Who is he?" she asked, voice even, eyes stormy. Miles exhaled slowly. "Name's Richard Kane. Works maintenance, Navy vet, decorated. Came in 5 years ago after his wife passed. Why is he cleaning floors? He asked to." Brielle blinked. Asked to. Yeah, said he didn't want anything that made noise. Just needed a quiet job somewhere nobody talked too much. She stared out the glass. Well, that's over. Meanwhile, on social media, someone had caught the whole thing. The video was only 11 seconds long. Captioned, simply Miratech janitor destroys the Gala Archery Challenge. Watch the CEO's face. By midnight, it had over 2 million views. By morning, news outlets would be calling. And by Monday, Richard Kane would no longer be invisible. But Richard didn't know that yet. He only knew the weight of the bow in his hands again. And the way his daughter looked at him, not like a janitor, not like a veteran, but like a hero who just remembered who he used to be. Tomorrow, the world would see the arrow. Tonight, he walked home in silence, and for the first time in years, he walked tall. The house on Chestnut Lane was quiet, too quiet for a home with a teenager inside. Richard turned the key gently, as if afraid to disturb the stillness he himself had brought in with him. The screen door creaked in that familiar tired way, and the scent of lemon oil and old wood met him like a memory. He stepped out of his boots, placed them beside Lena's sneakers, and for a long second, just stood there alone in his own entryway, backlit by the porch light, holding nothing but silence. Then a soft voice called from the living room. Dad. Lena appeared at the end of the hallway sketchbook, in hand pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked like her mother in that moment, hazel eyes too deep for her age, barefoot, messy-haired with one sock rolled halfway down. "You're late," she said, trying to sound casual. "Thought you'd be home by 10. Richard walked to her, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Lost track of time." "You never lose track of time." She tilted her head. Something happened. He exhaled slowly and motioned toward the kitchen. "Come sit, I'll make tea." Steam rose from chipped mugs as the kettle sang softly. Lena sat at the table hugging her sketchbook while watching her father closely. "I saw the video," she said, not looking away. Richard's hand paused over the honey jar. "I didn't post it," she added quickly. "It was someone else. But it's going everywhere. You're trending, Dad." He stirred the tea. "That's not exactly on my bucket list. You hit a moving target from 60 feet. Her voice was firm, while wearing a janitor's apron. "Everyone needs a hobby," he replied, sipping quietly. But Lena wasn't smiling. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Richard set the cup down. The clink of ceramic against wood filled the room like a dropped secret. She tried again, softer. "You taught me how to breathe before I speak, how to listen for the wind in the trees. But you never told me you used to compete, or serve, or anything." He leaned back in his chair. The worn navy blue t-shirt he wore faded. No logos hugged the quiet muscles of a man who'd once been built for war and precision. But now he just looked tired. "I stopped telling those stories," he said finally, "because they stopped being mine." Lena's eyes brimmed not with tears, but with the ache of realizing she'd only ever known a piece of him. "Mom knew, didn't she?" Richard nodded. "She saw me shoot once, said it scared her how calm I looked holding a weapon." "But it's not a weapon," Lena whispered. "No," he agreed. "Not always." He stood and walked over to a small wooden box tucked behind the bookshelf. Pulling it free, he placed it gently on the table between them. It wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Inside were a dozen items: a faded archery glove, an old competition patch with U.S. Armed Forces Invitational stitched in gold, a photograph of a much younger Richard, standing next to a target full of arrows, and next to him, a woman with auburn hair and laughter in her eyes. Mom Lena breathed, tracing the edge of the photo. She hated cameras. Richard said his smile almost fond. But she always stood next to me after a win. Lena lifted a medal from the box. This one says, "First place, Army Interbranch Nationals, 2004. You never told anyone at work." "No point," he said simply. "People don't see you for who you were. They see you for what you clean." A long silence passed between them, soft but full. Then Lena leaned back, cradling the box, like something sacred. "You're not invisible anymore," she said. Richard looked at her, then beyond her, to the window, where moonlight filtered through lace curtains dusting the room in silver. "I didn't want to be visible," he murmured. "Being seen means being asked. and I wasn't ready to answer. She frowned. Answer what? He hesitated, eyes distant. How you survive a war you're still fighting. Later that night, as Lena slept, her sketchbook open on the bed beside her pencil, lines half finished, Richard stood in the garage, surrounded by shadows. The bow hung on the far wall untouched for years. He ran his fingers along the worn grip, traced the memory of calluses long gone. In the corner sat a trunk, locked and heavy. He knelt, opened it, and pulled out an old quiver leather, faded to a soft brown stitched with his initials. He held one arrow in his hand, closed his eyes, and remembered the last mission, the last target, the screaming, the silence, the child whose name he never knew, the shot he didn't take. Outside wind chimes rang softly, Lena's gift from a craft fair last fall. He listened to them, hand still wrapped around the arrow, breathing like he used to, slow, steady, controlled. The war wasn't just in the past. It lived in the way he parked far from crowds, the way he scanned every room, the way he never sat with his back to the door. He wasn't afraid of being hurt. He was afraid of becoming someone else again. But something shifted tonight. A gaze from a woman who saw more than sweat and silence. A daughter's question sharp as any arrow. A moment in the spotlight, not to be praised, but to be remembered. Richard returned to the house just before dawn, placed the arrow back in its case. As he closed the garage door, he heard a quiet voice behind him. "You're not just my dad," Lena said. "You're the best archer I've ever seen." He turned to her, surprised. She smiled, sleepily, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. And maybe it's time everyone else sees that too. The Miratech executive office suite had always felt more like a war room than a place of business. Glass walls, white marble floors, and sharp lines of black metal carved a space that left no room for warmth. At the very center sat a woman whose presence could bend the air around her. Brielle Maddox. She wasn't just the CEO. She was Miratech, the face, the fire, the force behind its impossible rise. But today, she wasn't reading profit reports or acquisitions. She was staring at a paused video frame, a janitor in a wrinkled shirt holding a bow as if it were part of his body. And the arrow, frozen mid-flight, inches before impact. Bullseye. She hit play. Thwack. Replay. Thwack. Again. Thwack. The sound echoed in her chest more than the cavernous office. It had been years since anything stirred that deep. And yet here she was, leaning forward, rewinding again. Play it back. One more time. The intern beside her, pale, trembling, nodded and tapped the keyboard. This was no longer a funny video. This was research. This was personal. Brielle stood, arms crossed, walking slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked half the city. Her gaze, however, was turned inward. She hadn't touched a bow in 13 years. Not since her father, a West Point colonel and Olympian-turned businessman, threw her training gear into a fire pit when she chose Stanford's business program over the Olympic qualifiers. "Archery is a distraction," he'd said that night. "You aim for nothing, you'll hit it every time." She remembered the sting, the rage, and the silence that followed, not just from him, but from her. She had cut that part of herself out like a tumor. But watching Richard Kane shoot had cracked the seal. He didn't aim with ego. He didn't perform. He remembered. Every movement he made was intimate, reverent like prayer. And she could see the same ghosts in his stance that she once fought to suppress. Miles knocked softly before entering. "He's not answering calls," he said, matter of fact. "I stopped by his house. Garage light was on. Bow rack's been dusted. So he knows he's a topic now. He knows." Miles nodded. "But I don't think he wants to be." Brielle turned. "That's not his decision anymore." Miles raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to a framed photo on her shelf, her at age 16 grinning under a white sun visor, bow in hand, her father beside her, his expression unreadable even in stillness. She tapped the glass lightly. "You remember my college ranking?" Miles smirked. "Number 2 in the state, number 1 in attitude." She gave a half laugh. "You remember why I quit, Miles?" Hesitated. "Your father threatened to cut you off if you didn't focus on real-world targets." His words exactly. She nodded. He thought emotions clouded focus. "But I only ever shot best when I felt something." She paused. "Richard shot like that." Later that night, she pulled into an empty parking lot behind an old sports hall in the North District. The air smelled of rust and pine sap. Her heels clicked against concrete as she walked toward a padlocked side door, the one she hadn't opened since her last session over a decade ago. With a quiet breath, she pulled out a set of old keys and tried the first one. Click. Inside, the place hadn't changed. Wooden floors still held faded chalk lines. The wall targets were torn and soft. A long-forgotten banner still hung from the rafters: Maddox Girls Archery, Precision Power Poise. She turned on the floodlights. Dust danced in the beams, like ghosts returning to greet her. In a back closet, her bow still hung carbon fiber grip, molded to her palm string, slightly frayed, but intact. She stepped forward, lifted it down, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She nocked an arrow, aimed, thwip. Target grazed, again. Thwip. Too low. Third time. Steady hands. Exhale. Thwack. The arrow struck clean. Not center, but close. Her muscles remembered. Her body remembered. But something was missing. Heart. She closed her eyes, the shot ringing in her mind. It wasn't enough to remember. She needed to feel it again. The next morning, Brielle walked into her office without makeup. Hair tied back in a ponytail, carrying a large case under one arm and a cup of black coffee in the other. Her assistant did a double take. She dropped the case on the conference table. "I want a file on Richard Kane. Everything. Background, military record, family. And I want it done discreetly." "Yes, ma'am." "Should I inform PR about the video going viral?" "No, let it breathe. Should we reach out to him?" "Not yet." She paused. "I want to understand why he stopped." The assistant nodded and left quickly. Brielle sat down, opened the bow case, and ran her fingers along the string. She smiled, an expression foreign to this room. There's always a reason someone stops aiming, and she was going to find his. That night, she lay in bed, unable to sleep. The sound of Richard's arrow, the calm, the certainty looped in her mind. It wasn't just admiration. It was recognition. Two people, two pasts, two bows that had once been everything and were now calling them home. The old security booth at Meritech's underground garage was quiet, save for the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights and the soft crackle of a police scanner left on low. Miles Garrett leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankle, flipping through last week's incident logs more out of habit than necessity. He didn't need the job. 20 years in Army intelligence and another 5 in private security had left him comfortable enough. But routine had its comfort, and here, below the noise and egos of the corporate world, he could still hear himself think. So when Richard Kane's name started buzzing through the building like static, Miles didn't just take notice. He felt it in his bones. That shot, that silence, that stare from the CEO. Something had shifted, and now so many people were watching Richard, people who didn't know Richard. But Miles did. It was 11:42 a.m. when Richard walked through the east corridor, pushing a mop bucket as always. He didn't move like a man who'd gone viral overnight. No swagger, no change in gait. Still wore the same faded navy blue fatigues, still nodded politely at every intern who avoided eye contact. Miles intercepted him just before the elevator. "Got a minute?" Richard paused. "If it's about the shot, I didn't mean to make noise." Miles gave him a look. "Noise, Rich. You made history." CEO hasn't blinked that hard since she fired the entire R&D team in 21. Richard sighed. Wasn't my intention. I know. But that arrow stirred the water, brother. You stirred it. They walked in silence to the security office, where Miles poured 2 cups of burnt black coffee and slid one over. You still remember Camp Sherwood? Richard smirked. That field behind the barracks where you swore you could beat me in barebow at 50 yards, and almost did. Almost doesn't count with arrows. Miles chuckled, then turned serious. You were the best we had. When command said we needed precision under pressure, you were the guy. You weren't just a shooter. You were a calm. That mattered. Richard stared into his coffee. That man doesn't exist anymore. Miles folded his arms. Maybe. Or maybe he's just been hiding. Waiting. Richard looked up. For what? For a reason to pick up the bow again. Richard didn't answer. His eyes drifted to the corkboard on the wall, tacked with duty schedules, evacuation protocols, and a fading photo of him and Miles in desert camo arms, slung over each other's shoulders, squinting into a windstorm in Kandahar. A lifetime ago. You know what scares me most, Richard finally said. Not that I won't shoot well. Not that I'll embarrass myself. Miles waited. It's that I will shoot well. That the muscle memory's still there. That part of me still wants to be seen. Miles nodded slowly. And why is that scary? Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. Because when people look at you, they expect you to stay who you were when they found you, not who you need to become. That afternoon, Brielle called another meeting. This time, not in the boardroom. It was in the Miratech Community Wing, a rarely used event space on the ground floor, designed for public outreach charity work and employee families. Most employees didn't even know it had a small indoor archery range in the back, something Brielle herself had insisted on during construction, but had since avoided like a shadow. She stood at the far end, looking at the old targets lined along the wall. Each one bore scars of past demonstrations, long since forgotten. Miles entered quietly. You called this meeting, I want him to come back, Brielle said without turning. Miles raised an eyebrow. And do what? Put on a show? No. Teach. To who she turned, arms crossed. To anyone who's lost their aim. Later that week, a formal invitation was left in Richard's locker. Hand-delivered. Cream-colored envelope. Gold-embossed Miratech seal. Inside, Mr. Kane. We cordially invite you to join us as a guest mentor for our upcoming community gala. A live demonstration of archery skill will be featured to promote focus, discipline, and healing through sport. We believe your story and your skill have more to offer than one arrow. With respect, B. Maddox. Richard stared at it for a long time. He didn't crumple it, didn't throw it away. He just folded it, placed it in his back pocket, and walked home. That night, Lena waited for him on the front porch, feet curled beneath her, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and her sketchbook in her lap. You're quiet, she said. I usually am. More than usual. He handed her the envelope. She opened it carefully, scanning the words, her face brightening. They want you to perform again. Richard didn't respond. You're going to do it right, she asked, hopeful. I don't know. Why not? He looked out toward the dark horizon. Because last time I let myself step forward, something precious got taken away. Lena touched his hand. You always tell me not to let fear decide for me. He glanced at her quiet. She added softly, So what are you afraid of, Dad? That you'll matter again? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. It began with a sketch, a simple charcoal drawing in the back of a spiral-bound notebook, the kind that Lena Kane carried everywhere, even to the grocery store. It wasn't meant for the world to see. It wasn't polished, or framed, or lit with filters. But it was honest. A man stood alone in the center of a vast field, bow-drawn body poised not in aggression but in reverence. His face was quiet, his eyes focused on something unseen. Behind him, shadows of the past curled like smoke. Before him, the sky opened, and on the margin, Lena had scribbled 4 words in pencil. He doesn't miss twice. Richard didn't know about the drawing at first. He didn't know she'd scanned it into her tablet, added a soft animation loop of wind rippling through the grass, and synced it to a 12-second clip she'd taken from the night he practiced in the backyard, just 3 arrows flying silently into makeshift hay bales under moonlight. She uploaded it to a small channel she'd created months ago. Silent strings, no face, no name, just music sketches and glimpses of her father in quiet motion. She didn't expect it to go viral. She just wanted anyone to see what she saw. And someone did. A retired veteran with PTSD commented, "This calms me. I haven't picked up my bow in 18 years. Maybe I should again." A mother wrote, "My teenage son said this made him want to focus better. He's on the spectrum. Thank you." By morning, the video had 75,000 views. By afternoon, 400,000. By night, over 1 million. And still rising. At breakfast, Richard noticed his phone buzzing more than usual. Messages from unknown numbers. Emails with subject lines like interview request, feature opportunity. Your story touched me. He rubbed his temples and stared at his phone like it had betrayed him. Lena chewed her cereal quietly across the table, sketchbook propped open beside her. "Lena," he said, his voice steady but low, "did you post something?" She didn't flinch. "Yes." He looked up sharply. "Why? Because they needed to see," she said. "What I see every day." Richard exhaled slowly. "That wasn't your story to share." "But you won't share it yourself," she said. "You keep hiding like you're still on a battlefield. But you're not, Dad. You're here. You're back. And I wanted people to see that." He stood up, walked toward the window, arms folded. Outside, wind bent the branches low. The quiet of their cul-de-sac no longer felt like refuge. It felt invaded. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered. "No," Lena replied gently. "But maybe you needed it anyway." Meanwhile, inside a glass-paneled boardroom in downtown Seattle, Brielle, Maddox, stared at the same video Lena's post, projected across a 90-inch screen. She'd seen 1,000 videos go viral. Drones over oceans, robots, folding laundry billionaires pretending to care. But this one, it breathed. No soundtrack, no voiceover, just movement, focus, stillness. It was not about fame, it was about presence. "This is your angle," said Serena, her VP of marketing, sipping coffee beside her. "You partner with him. It's a win-win. Humanizes your brand, inspires veterans, taps into mindfulness therapy, digital detox, all of it." But Brielle wasn't listening to metrics. She was watching the way Richard's daughter had drawn him, surrounded by silence, but not consumed by it. The kind of silence she remembered from her own childhood too. A silence not of peace, but of suppression. That evening, Richard didn't go to the community range. He didn't return Brielle's email. He didn't answer Miles's texts. Instead, he walked to the old storage unit on 9th Street, the one he kept under a fake name since he returned from his final deployment. Inside, among dusty boxes and crates, he found the case. He hadn't opened it in years. He clicked the latches, lifted the lid. Inside was his tournament bow. Sleek, custom-made gift from a sponsor long forgotten. His fingers hovered above it like greeting an old friend he wasn't sure he forgave. He lifted it out, checked the string, adjusted the rest. Then he took a single arrow from the quiver, stepped outside behind the unit, where a narrow alley met a brick wall painted with graffiti. It wasn't a field. It wasn't a stage. but it was space. He knocked the arrow, breathed, drew back, and fired. The arrow struck a rusted soda can atop a crate 20 yards away, split it clean in half. His hands didn't tremble, but his heart did. Back home, Lena sat on her bed, watching the comments pile up. One in particular made her pause. I served with him. Afghanistan, 2009. He saved my life. He never missed. Then another. My son met him at the community center once. Said he was the kindest man he'd ever met. Gave him an old glove to practice with. And another, I thought I was alone. Watching this gave me hope again. Lena closed the laptop, tears brimming, not of guilt, but of confirmation. She hadn't exposed her father. She'd revealed him. At 11:47 p.m., Richard stepped into Lena's room. She looked up from her sketchbook, bracing for a lecture. Instead, he held something out. His old glove. Worn leather soft. The one from the storage unit. "Help me clean it up tomorrow," he asked. Lena blinked. "You mean, I might need it," he said. Then after a pause, "If I'm going to do this, it's going to be for the right reason." She nodded. "And what reason is that?" she asked. He gave the faintest smile. "To remember who I am, and to show you where you come from." The invitation came again, this time not through email or courier, but hand-delivered by Miles himself. Richard was crouched beneath the east stairwell at Miratech, replacing a cracked floor panel, when he heard the heavy boots approach. Without looking up, he muttered, "If this is about the community gala, the answer hasn't changed." Miles chuckled, but there was a softness to it. No speech today. Just this. He extended a small envelope, not gold, not embossed, just handwritten for Lena's father. That stopped Richard cold. He wiped his hands on a rag and slowly opened it. Inside was a folded letter, written in delicate, looping cursive. "Dear Mr. Kane, I know what it feels like to lose your way, to hide the parts of yourself that once gave you joy because they no longer feel like yours. But watching you shoot, it didn't just awaken something in me. It reminded me of the girl I left behind a long time ago, the one who loved precision, not power. Focus, not fame. We're hosting a quiet event. No media, no speeches, just people who need hope. You once aimed with grace. Perhaps this time you'll aim with healing. Sincerely, Brielle Maddox." That night, Richard sat alone on the back porch, the letter resting on his lap like a weight. The stars above Washington blinked gently as if waiting. From inside the house came the soft scrape of pencil on paper, Lena sketching as always. Life moved on as it always did, but something in him felt paused, held. He folded the letter and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Maybe this time he wouldn't aim for the target. Maybe he'd aim for something more important. "Do you remember what I used to say before a shot?" Lena looked up from tightening the string on his old practice bow. "You mean the breath and release part?" Richard smiled faintly. "No. Before that." She tilted her head. "I used to whisper, not at it, into it." He mimicked drawing a bow, the motion precise, reverent. Anyone can hit a target. But the arrow that carries truth, that's the one that matters. Lena stared at him like she was memorizing not just his words, but the shape of his voice. Then, without asking, she slipped her hand into his calloused palm. "Then maybe this is your truth, Dad." Saturday came like a held breath. The Miratech community wing had been transformed, not into a press event, but into something softer. Rows of folding chairs, children's artwork hanging along the walls. A single archery lane extended through the center, ending in a wooden target lit by warm lanterns instead of stage lights. There was no crowd, no camera crews, only about 50 people, employees, veterans, teens from local shelters, scattered in quiet anticipation. Brielle stood near the edge of the stage, dressed simply in jeans and a navy sweater, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her usual mask of confidence had been replaced by something rawer, more present. And when Richard walked in, wearing his worn fatigue shirt leather glove in hand, and Lena at his side, something shifted in the room. Not applause, not whispers, just stillness. Respectful, earned. "Do you need a warm-up?" Brielle asked gently as he approached. He glanced at the bow she'd laid out for him, his old model newly restrung. "No. I've had a lifetime of warm-ups," she nodded, stepping back. "Take your time." Richard looked down the range. The target was 40 feet away. Not difficult. But that wasn't the point. He glanced at the people gathered. An older man with shaking hands, a teenage girl with a counselor's badge, a young boy with a prosthetic arm who leaned forward, eyes wide. Richard inhaled, exhaled, and drew. But before he loosed the first arrow, he turned to the boy. "What's your name, son Lucas?" the boy replied, voice thin. Richard lowered the bow, walked over, removed his glove. He knelt, meeting the boy eye to eye. "You want to try?" The room rustled with surprise. The boy's eyes widened. "I can't. I've never." Richard gently took the bow in one hand and extended it. "I'll stand with you." They walked to the line together. Richard knelt behind him, guided his fingers, helped him knock the arrow. Lucas's tiny hand trembled. "Don't worry about hitting it," Richard whispered. "Just breathe and feel." The boy drew, shaky, but brave. Richard steadied his elbow. "Now, into it." The arrow flew off center, slow dipping just before the target, but it landed. A solid thunk into the lower hay. The room erupted in soft, stunned applause. Lucas looked up at Richard, lips parted in awe. "I hit it," he whispered. "You did," Richard said. "Because you aimed with your heart." Richard stepped back to the line alone this time. The second arrow flew fast, thwack center ring, then another into the air, striking a suspended apple. Then one more blindfolded a feet from his competition, dazed through a rotating ring. Each time the room held its breath. Each time silence turned to wonder. But Richard wasn't performing. He was sharing. Each shot was a conversation between grief and growth loss, and legacy silence and voice. When he finally lowered the bow, the room stood not in frenzy but in reverence. Brielle approached him, her eyes glassy. "Thank you," she said. "For every arrow." Richard looked around at the children, at the elders, at his daughter smiling through tears. "No," he replied. "Thank them. I only reminded them what they forgot." That night, back home, Lena handed him her latest sketch. It was the two of them, father and daughter, standing at the target, their hands resting on a single arrow embedded in the center. Below it, in neat cursive, she had written, "The arrow doesn't choose the target. The archer does." Richard looked at her and nodded. For the first time in years, he was ready to choose. The Miratech Autumn Gala wasn't just a company event. It was a spectacle. Held each year under the glittering rotunda of the Glass Pavilion downtown, it brought together tech giants, foreign investors, politicians, and celebrities in a swirling blur of power suits and champagne. Last year, they'd unveiled a self-driving drone prototype to thunderous applause. The year before, a holographic product pitch that went viral. This year, Brielle Maddox planned something far quieter and infinitely riskier. Backstage, the atmosphere buzzed. Staff in headsets scurried between velvet curtains. Event planners whispered into clipboards. But in the center of it all, standing with calm stillness in the prep area marked "Demonstration Guest," was a man who didn't belong and yet belonged more than anyone else. Richard Kane, dressed in a simple black shirt, jeans, and his old archery glove, he looked like a man from another time. Beside him stood Lena, her hand in his, dressed in a modest navy dress she'd picked out at Goodwill and patched herself. On her back hung a slim camera bag. "You good?" Richard asked softly. She looked up at him and nodded. "Are you?" He exhaled slowly. "Ask me again when it's over." From across the staging area, Brielle approached, clipboard in hand. Her hair was tied in a practical low bun, and for the first time at a gala, she wasn't wearing heels. Just flats. Comfortable. Quiet. "I thought you weren't coming," she said gently. Richard shrugged. "I didn't think I would. But then I remembered spotlight or not, the shot still matters." She gave a faint smile. "You're not here to entertain them, Richard. You're here to remind them." Of what she met his eyes. Stillness. Focus. Courage. He nodded, and then the lights dimmed. The MC's voice echoed through the rotunda. "Ladies and gentlemen, Miratech is proud to present not a product, but a moment. A tribute to precision discipline and the silent art of intention. Please welcome Mr. Richard Kane." The spotlight narrowed to a single golden beam. It illuminated the archer standing alone on a circular hardwood platform. No background music, no fanfare, just him, a bow, a quiver, and a target at the far end of the hall, suspended, rotating slowly, lit by a soft halo of white. People whispered, eyebrows raised. Wasn't he the janitor? Is this a joke? Why is the CEO watching so intently? Richard stepped forward. He didn't bow. He didn't speak. He knocked an arrow, closed his eyes, and drew back. Silence, then thwack. Dead center. The target stopped rotating. A small gasp rippled through the crowd. Before the awe settled, Richard lifted a second arrow. This one curved, a trick arrow bent slightly at the spine. He adjusted his angle. Let it fly. It curved midair and struck a hanging lantern that had been lowered silently just moments before. Another gasp. Then came the third arrow, fired backwards over his shoulder, using a pivot turn, eyes closed. It struck the center of a spinning ring 20 feet off the ground. Someone dropped a glass. Then, without warning, Richard set down his bow and picked up a blindfold. He walked to the edge of the stage where Lena waited. She handed him one final arrow, custom-painted white, its fletching dipped in silver ink. He smiled at her, then turned to the audience. "For my daughter," he said. The only words he spoke all night. He tied the blindfold. The crowd held its breath. The spotlight dimmed slightly, and the final target appeared, a series of thin glowing rings, suspended at intervals, spinning independently, creating a nearly impossible path. Richard inhaled. Lena whispered, "Not at it. Into it." He loosed. The arrow sliced the air, gliding through the first ring, narrowly clearing the second, twisting, past the third, and landing in the bullseye mounted behind them all. Silence. Then, a thunderous standing ovation. But Richard didn't acknowledge it. He turned, removed the blindfold, and walked to Lena. She threw her arms around him. Then something unexpected happened. Brielle, still standing near the side, stepped into the spotlight. Slowly, hesitantly. She approached the bow, picked it up, knocked her own arrow hands, clearly rusty but resolute. Richard watched her quietly. She drew, breathed, released. The arrow missed, clipped the edge of the target, and spun away. A few guests laughed, nervous chuckles more than cruelty. Brielle stood still, then laughed too softly, genuinely. She turned to Richard. "Guess I'm not who I used to be." He approached her. "No," he said. "You're someone braver." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you're not afraid to try again." Later that night, when the guests had all gone and the staff had begun folding chairs, Richard stood alone in the rotunda. He looked up at the arched glass ceiling. The stars shimmered faintly beyond. Brielle joined him. She had taken off her shoes, walked barefoot across the wooden floor. "You gave them something tonight," she said. "So did you," he replied. They stood together in the quiet. "You're not a janitor," she whispered. "I was never just that," he said. "And I'm not just a CEO," she added. They looked at each other, something unspoken hanging between them. Not romance, not yet. But understanding. Recognition. Two lives built on control, slowly rediscovering surrender. Outside, Lena waited at the car earbuds and watching the comments flood in under a live stream someone had posted. She smiled, then opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and drew a new image. Her father standing on stage. The CEO beside him, arrow in hand, and between them, not a target, but a light. The rooftop of Miratech's downtown headquarters wasn't listed in any floor plan. You had to know the freight elevator's override code and trust it wouldn't jam on the way to floor R. Most employees didn't even know the roof had a garden, let alone teak benches climbing ivy, and a view of the Sound that turned golden just before dusk. Richard Kane hadn't been up here since his second week on the job. Back then, he came to escape the echoing clatter of office shoes and small talk he couldn't relate to. Tonight, though, he wasn't hiding. He was meeting her. Brielle Maddox arrived quietly carrying a paper bag and 2 bottles of sparkling water. She wore flats again, a gray cardigan wrapped over a simple t-shirt. No makeup, no boardroom armor. "You're early," she said, handing him a bottle. "Military habit." They sat in silence for a while, the hum of distant traffic below them like a forgotten song. "You didn't have to say yes to this," she said. Richard unscrewed the cap. "I didn't say yes to a meeting. I said yes to a moment." That made her smile, faint but real. "What's the difference? A meeting has an agenda." He turned toward her. "A moment just asks you to show up." She unwrapped a sandwich from the bag and tore it in half, offering him a piece. They ate quietly, like people who'd survived too much noise. Then slowly she said, "You know, I used to train 4 hours a day. Archery wasn't just a sport, it was my anchor." He nodded. "I know the feeling. I stopped when I was 20. Her voice softened. "After my father made it clear there was no room for emotion in leadership, that anything not directly tied to performance was weakness." Richard listened, not interrupting. "I thought walking away from it meant I was strong enough to choose my future. But watching you on that stage..." She paused, exhaling. "It reminded me how much I've shaped my life around avoiding the parts of myself that felt too soft, too human." Richard looked out at the horizon, where the last of the sun spilled orange light across the bay. "I know something about cutting pieces of yourself off," he said. "You think you're protecting others from the damage, but really you're just making yourself smaller, quieter, until one day you forget what your own voice sounds like." She turned toward him. "And what made you start listening again?" He glanced down at the bottle in his hand, then at the scar on his knuckle, a thin white line from a decade ago, one of the few wounds that ever healed completely. "My daughter drew me," he said simply. "Not how I was. How she saw me." Brielle's eyes glistened, not with tears, but recognition. "And that was enough?" she asked. He shook his head. It wasn't enough. But it was the first arrow, the one that broke the silence. They sat there a while longer, letting the quiet breathe between them. Then she asked, "Do you ever regret serving?" Richard leaned back against the bench. The question wasn't casual. She didn't mean politics or patriotism. She meant the cost. "I regret what I brought home," he said after a pause. "Not the memories, not the missions, the silence, the distance, the instinct to shut down every time something got too close." She looked at him with a depth that bypassed sympathy and landed squarely in understanding. "That's exactly how I run my company," she admitted. "With distance, with precision, but never presence. Richard gave her a side glance. Until recently. A wry smile tugged at her mouth. Until a janitor with a bow made the richest man in the room drop his champagne. He laughed softly. Then she added quieter, "You didn't just hit the target that night, Richard. You recentered the room." He absorbed that, and for the first time in a long while he didn't deflect the compliment. Below them, Miratech's lobby bustled with cleaning crews and late-night coders. But up here, on this forgotten rooftop, two people once weapons in their own way, sat like wounded warriors learning to be human again. Finally, Brielle stood. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the gala, the reaction, the way people, especially the veterans and kids, responded to it." He looked at her. "I want to build something," she said. "Not for cameras, not for stockholders, for healing." Richard's brow furrowed. "What kind of something?" "An archery program," she said, "integrated into local community centers, partnered with trauma counselors. A space where people like you, like me, can find their center again." He didn't speak right away. "It doesn't need to have my name on it," she added quickly. "Or yours. But it does need someone who understands how to aim without hurting. Who knows how to teach others to breathe again?" He studied her for a long moment. "You're not asking me to perform," he said. "No," she replied. "I'm asking you to guide." Richard turned to the skyline again as if measuring something invisible. After a pause, he said, "I don't have a speech, or a 5-year plan. I don't like structure much these days." Brielle smiled. "Good. The people I want to help are already buried in structure." He gave a slow nod. "Then maybe we give them air instead." When they finally walked toward the elevator, the rooftop garden behind them rustled in the wind. Leaves fell like drifting arrows, aimless, quiet, but full of grace. At the threshold, Brielle paused. "You never told me what it felt like. That night. On stage." Richard glanced back at the skyline. It felt, he said, like I wasn't aiming alone. And for the first time in a long time, they both smiled without pain behind it. The first time Richard walked into the old gymnasium on 14th Street, he was hit by the scent of dustwood polish and distant memory. It wasn't much to look at. Fluorescent lights flickered like they were apologizing. The walls were scuffed with the ghosts of old basketball games. A sagging volleyball net hung in one corner like a forgotten relic. But in the center of the space stood a single archery target, hand-painted crooked on its stand, but waiting. Waiting for something more than arrows. Waiting for someone to aim with purpose. Brielle was already there, in jeans and a windbreaker. Her sleeves rolled up. She'd been helping a volunteer unpack donated gear, gloves, arm guards, starter bows. No press, no camera crew, just action. When she saw Richard step through the double doors, she smiled small, genuine. "Looks a little different from the Miratech Rotunda, huh?" she said. He nodded. "Less marble, more heart. That's the idea." He walked slowly, letting his boots echo across the warped gym floor. "So this is it. This is where you want to start." She handed him a folded flyer. "Aim Forward, Healing Through Archery, a community program for veterans, teens, and trauma survivors." Richard read the tagline again. Healing Through Archery. It was the first time he saw the word healing used, without sounding like a slogan. "Who's showing up to this?" he asked. Brielle glanced toward the bleachers, where 3 people had already taken seats. A teenage boy with a worn hoodie pulled tight over his head, a middle-aged woman with sunken eyes and arms folded tight across her chest, and an older man in a military ball cap, staring down at his cane like it held the answers. "I don't know their names yet," Brielle said, "but I know why they're here." Richard studied them, then looked back at her. "This won't be easy," she shrugged. "Nothing worth aiming at ever is." Richard didn't give a speech that day. He simply walked to the target, set down a bow, and began. No spotlight. No exhibition. just the basics. This is how you stand. This is how you breathe. This is how you listen to the string, the silence yourself. Lena stood off to the side, filming quietly on her phone, not for views, but for memory. For proof that rebirth doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like 3 people in a worn-out gym holding bows with trembling fingers and too much pain in their eyes. But slowly they began to shoot. Not well. Not consistently. But honestly, over the next few weeks the group grew. A young woman who hadn't spoken since her brother died in combat came drawn by a flyer Lena posted at the library. A boy with anxiety, whose fingers shook so hard he couldn't hold a pencil until Richard taught him how to focus through breath, not force. Miles stopped by after shifts, helping adjust stances and nodding encouragement. Even Brielle, after much protest, took up a bow again, missing wildly, but laughing more than she had in years. They trained in the mornings, or after school, or whenever someone simply needed to come in and breathe. And Richard. He stopped flinching when people clapped, stopped apologizing when he needed quiet, started teaching not just how to shoot, but why. One afternoon, Lena approached him after class. She held her sketchbook open to a page titled, "Aiming is not about distance, it's about decision." Below the title was a sketch of him, not as a soldier, not as a janitor, but as a teacher. Surrounded by students, every arrow on the page curved outward, then slowly, beautifully toward a shared center. "I think this is who you are now," she said. Richard looked at the drawing, then at her. "I don't know who I am yet," he replied honestly. "But you're closer," Lena said. He nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." Brielle called him one evening from the back steps of the gym, barefoot again, drinking tea from a chipped mug. "There's a tech investor who wants to fund 10 more centers," she said. "He saw a live stream of the kids last week. Says it's the first real thing he's watched in months." Richard chuckled. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's the start of something." She paused, then gently added, "And I think we should co-lead this. Officially." Richard blinked. "I'm not a nonprofit guy, Brielle. I'm not even a plan-a-week-ahead guy. You're not." She agreed. "But you're the heart of it. And I know strategy, logistics, how to get things built. We'd balance each other." He considered that. Like a bow and string. She smiled into the phone. Exactly. Later that night, Richard found himself alone at the range. Everyone had gone home, even Lena. But something about the silence invited him to stay. He walked to the far wall where a new target had been hung. Clean, unmarked, no dents, no scars. He knocked a single arrow, drew, held. Then he whispered softly into the air, not at it, into it, and released. Thwack, right through the center. He smiled, not because he hit it, but because this time he knew why he had aimed. The morning air at the Southridge Community Center carried the scent of rain-soaked leaves and wood polish. Inside the modest courtyard, once used for weekend flea markets and small-town craft fairs, a different rhythm had taken root. Not the chaotic shuffle of haggling voices or the buzz of second-hand bargains, but the steady hum of breath, the creak of bows being drawn, the woof of arrows cutting through morning silence. It was no longer just a program. It was becoming a sanctuary. The first class of Aim Forward now met 3 times a week, and the changes were beginning to show, not just in their shooting, but in their shoulders, in their postures, in their eyes. The teenage boy in the hoodie, now known as Caleb, no longer kept his head down. He had started wearing an old baseball cap backward and would offer shy tips to newcomers. "Loosen your back fingers. Don't fight the bow." Marta, the quiet, middle-aged woman, had brought her sister last week. They stayed after class just to sit on the benches in silence, soaking in something that didn't need words. Even Lucas, the young boy with the prosthetic arm, had learned how to brace a bow with one hand and pull with a strap device. Richard spent hours modifying gear just to give him back his rhythm. When Lucas finally hit his first true center, he whispered, "I didn't shake that time," and wiped his face like it was sweat, not tears. There were no medals, no trophies, just growth and quiet. And that was enough. Richard walked the line that morning not with the discipline of a soldier or the caution of a survivor, but with the presence of a teacher who no longer feared being seen. He didn't talk much. His hands did the explaining. A gentle correction on elbow alignment. A quiet nod of encouragement when someone trembled. A hand on a shoulder, reminding them to breathe before aiming. Brielle had joined as a participant. Now, not a guest. She came early, stayed late. And to everyone's surprise, she practiced harder than most of the teens. She still missed more than she hit, but that didn't bother her anymore. Not after the day she stood at the line, released a shot, and it thudded into the outer ring. Off-center, she muttered, lowering her bow. Richard walked up behind her, leaned in and said, quietly, "Still on the board." "That's farther than most people ever get." She turned to him with a look that mixed frustration and gratitude, then smiled. One Wednesday afternoon, a new visitor arrived. A man in his early 50s, tall, lean, with a military posture that couldn't be undone by civilian clothes. His left hand bore a faint tremor. His right eye had a crescent-shaped scar just under the socket. Richard noticed him immediately, not because he looked dangerous, but because he looked like someone trying not to be. The man didn't ask for help, just stood at the back, watching the others shoot. After 20 minutes, Richard walked over and offered him a bow. "You're welcome to join." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Haven't picked one of these up since Kuwait." Richard studied him. "You ever miss it?" The man didn't answer with words. He drew the bow and shot. The arrow hit left, far from the center, but steady. He lowered the bow and looked at Richard. "I missed the quiet more than the aim." That night, Richard stayed late alone on the range. He wasn't shooting, just watching the target sway slightly in the night breeze like they were breathing with him. Lena found him there, curled in the corner with her sketchbook on her knees, a thermos of cocoa by her side. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Better than I've been in a long time." She opened her sketchbook and showed him her newest piece. It was a drawing of Lucas and Marta, standing side by side, bows drawn mirroring each other like a reflection through time. At the top, she'd written, "We don't draw weapons, we draw breath." Richard stared at it for a long while, then gently took the page and pressed it against his chest. "May I keep this?" Lena nodded. "It's yours. Like the program, like the people, like this whole life." He looked at her eyes full. "You gave me this, Lena, when you posted that first video, when you believed before I did." She shrugged, but her eyes glistened. Sometimes the arrow knows where to go before the archer does. In the weeks that followed, Aim Forward received a quiet grant from a local veterans foundation. Not flashy, not political, just enough to repair the gym lights, buy extra bows, print more flyers. One day, a kid from the city's foster program arrived with a backpack full of trauma and a face carved from stone. He refused to speak, refused to shoot. Richard gave him a glove and said nothing. 2 weeks later, the boy smiled for the first time after striking his first hay bale and turning to see Lena clapping wildly with cocoa in hand. Brielle began planning an expansion softly, carefully, not as a brand campaign, but as something real. And Richard, he didn't just teach anymore. He guided. Each student, not just a pupil, but a mirror. Each lesson, not a drill, but a thread weaving a broken net back together. One morning, as he unlocked the side gate to the gym, he saw someone had painted a message across the wall in soft blue brushstrokes. "Here we draw breath, not blood. Below it, unsigned, was a single drawn arrow tip, pointed upward, not toward battle, but skyward. Hopeful. Unafraid. Richard stood in front of it for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out the white arrow Lena had given him after the gala performance. He planted it into the ground beneath the mural, let the wind tug gently at the fletching, and whispered to himself, still flying. It began as a small idea on the back of a napkin. Brielle had jotted it down one rainy evening at the diner across from the Southridge Community Center. Let's host a family and healing day. No speeches, just arrows. When she showed it to Richard, he chuckled. That's the best tagline I've heard all year. 2 weeks later, under the soft gray clouds of a Pacific Northwest spring afternoon, that napkin became reality. No banners, no podiums, just a wide-open park, borrowed from the city, 10 newly painted targets, staked into the grass, and rows of folding chairs, forming a gentle semicircle under swaying maple trees. They called it the Arch of Healing. And everyone came. Marta arrived first arm in arm with her sister, both wearing matching denim jackets, and beaming in a way that only people who've survived something unspeakable can. Caleb rolled in on his bike, hoodie half-zipped, nodding with casual coolness, while pretending not to be proud that he was now helping younger kids adjust their grips. Lucas, determined as ever, brought his own bow modified with duct tape, and parts Richard had helped him craft from scrap. He wore a bright red baseball cap and insisted on setting up the first station. Lena had organized the sign-in booth, but spent most of the time sketching families in soft pencil lines, capturing movement, emotion, stillness. Even Miles showed up, wearing a slightly wrinkled polo shirt and carrying a duffel bag of refreshments. Don't expect me to shoot, he warned, but I do pour a hell of a lemonade. The event wasn't flashy, and that was the point. One corner of the field hosted gentle breathing workshops led by a local counselor. Another had archery basics for kids, taught not by instructors, but by the very people who once trembled in those same lessons just months ago. Richard didn't lead from the front that day. He walked among the crowd, quiet, watchful, ready to offer a nod, a correction, a wordless glance of affirmation. People seemed to settle around him the way arrows settle into a quiver, naturally, instinctively. It wasn't charisma, it was presence. In the early afternoon, Brielle kicked off a surprise exhibition, a 3-person shot. She didn't announce who would perform it. Instead, she walked to the center of the range, lifted her bow, and raised her hand silently. Richard and Lena joined her without a word. 3 generations of broken and healing hearts standing shoulder to shoulder. They each knocked 1 arrow. A timer spun overhead, an old windmill blade Lena had painted with bright colors and mounted to a pole. It turned slowly, then faster, then paused in rhythm. They waited, breathed. Lena whispered, "Together." Brielle nodded, "Together." Richard whispered, "Not at it." And they released 3 arrows, whistling in air, spinning like dancers through wind. And mid-air, impossibly, they met. A soft collision, just enough to kiss fletchings. And yet all 3 still found the target. Not center, but close, unified. The crowd exhaled, stunned by the beauty, the silence, the intention. Not a spectacle, a moment. Afterward, Brielle stood off to the side watching the families mingle and laugh. A boy tumbled into her leg, chasing his younger sister, then giggled and ran off without apology. She blinked, smiled. "I didn't think I'd feel this again," she said softly as Richard approached. He raised an eyebrow. "Joy?" "No." She looked at him. "Belonging." He nodded slowly. "It's easy to forget, isn't it? What being part of something honest feels like." She turned to face him. "This started with you, Richard." He shook his head. "No. This started the moment someone chose to stop aiming for power and started aiming for people. Their eyes met, and for once there was no tension, no uncertainty, just mutual gravity. As the event wound down, children helped gather arrows. Teens coiled ropes. Elderly veterans folded chairs without being asked. No one wanted to leave. Not yet. So Brielle pulled a small speaker from her car, played a soft acoustic playlist, and someone, Lena of course, suggested an impromptu archery circle under the trees. Everyone joined in. Slowly. Laughing. Missing targets. Trying again. Richard sat on a hay bale, Lena at his side watching it all unfold. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "You know," she said sleepily, "this feels like what Mom would have wanted." He closed his eyes and nodded. "Yeah, I think she's here." Lena looked up. "Do you think she'd like Brielle?" Richard chuckled. "I think she'd give me a look." "What kind of look?" "The kind that says, 'You're not as subtle as you think.'" They both laughed. As dusk settled and golden light kissed the tops of the trees, someone from the crowd held up a phone and asked, "Can we take a picture?" All of us people gathered in a wide arc, students, veterans, kids, strangers who'd found something real in this patch of grass. Richard stood beside Brielle Lena at his side. 3 bows rested in front of them like symbols of everything they'd unlearned. And just before the shutter clicked, someone shouted, "Say bullseye." But no one did. They just smiled. Because in that moment, they were already hitting the mark. The email arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, buried beneath a stack of auto-forwarded updates, promotional spam, and program logistics. Richard nearly deleted it without reading, but something about the subject line gave him pause. "We'd like to hear your story again." The message was from a senior producer at the Everyday Heart, a nationally syndicated show known for featuring unsung heroes and stories that restored faith in humanity, as their tagline proudly claimed. They wanted Richard to appear in a live segment archery demonstration optional alongside Brielle to discuss Aim Forward's rise from a janitor's unexpected shot to a multi-city trauma recovery initiative. Richard stared at the screen. Then he closed his laptop. The following evening, as the gym emptied out and dusk crept through the windows, Richard found himself lingering alone. The targets had all been stacked against the far wall. The bows hung neatly on their racks, but the echo of the day still vibrated in the air. Laughter, deep exhales, the satisfying thump of arrows connecting. He walked slowly to the center. Matt stood where so many had learned to steady their hands and their breath. The place where stillness became healing. Lena's words came back to him. "You're not just helping people shoot, Dad. You're helping them aim again." He didn't need a television appearance to prove that. But something about the invitation gnawed at him. Not pride, not fear. Responsibility. He brought it up to Brielle the next morning over coffee in the staff kitchen. She listened quietly, stirring honey into her cup, her expression unreadable. "I'm not interested in being a symbol," Richard said. "I'm not someone's redemption arc." "No," she agreed. "You're not. But maybe it's not about you." He looked up. She held his gaze. "Maybe it's about the next vet who hasn't left his apartment in 6 months. Or the kid who thinks shaking hands means he's broken. Or the widow who hasn't spoken to anyone since she lost her son. Maybe they're watching. Maybe this is the arrow they need." He was quiet for a long time. Then finally said, "I'll go. But only if Lena comes with me." Brielle smiled. She was already packing. The studio in Seattle was colder than expected. Bright lights, tight hallways, makeup artists offering powder. Richard politely refused. Lena, however, was having a grand time chatting with the production team, showing them her sketchbook, even getting a short interview of her own. "Is it true your drawing went viral before your dad even knew?" one assistant asked. She smirked. Guilty. Then she held up her most recent drawing, a soft charcoal image of a group huddled around a campfire in a field of targets, not shooting, just being. At the top, in soft handwriting, it read, "Sometimes hope doesn't hit the bullseye. Sometimes it lands nearby and waits." The assistant stared at it for a long time. Then asked if he could make a copy for the green room. Richard stepped onto the stage as the segment began, not with applause, with stillness. The host, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, named Marvin Tate, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Kane, you've been called many things, veteran janitor, mentor, healer. But I want to ask you something simpler." Richard nodded. "Who are you now?" There was a pause. Then Richard replied, voice low and steady. "I'm someone who forgot how to aim and learned again. Not at targets, but at people." Marvin leaned in. And what changed? He glanced toward the side stage where Lena watched proudly. "My daughter believed in who I was before I remembered." The audience leaned in as Richard described the early days. The silence, the retreat from himself, the mending. He spoke not with drama but clarity. No theatrics, no heroism, just truth. When Brielle joined him mid-segment, the conversation turned toward community, healing. How archery became a language spoken in silence, where trauma didn't have to be explained, only felt and released. At the end, Marvin asked if Richard would consider shooting one arrow for the audience. Richard paused, then stood. "No tricks," he said. "No blindfold, just one shot." He walked to the mark set up on stage, the target resting against a dark curtain backdrop. He drew, breathed, released. Thwack. The arrow struck not dead center, slightly left, but solid. He turned to the audience. "I'm not aiming for perfection," he said. "I'm aiming for presence." The segment aired that evening. The response was instant. Emails, letters, donations, requests from cities across the country to start their own Aim Forward chapters. But Richard didn't read most of them. He sat on the back porch with Lena that night, watching the wind bend the tall grass, sipping Coco's sketchbook on her lap. She turned to him. "Do you regret doing it?" He shook his head. "No, because now the story doesn't belong to me anymore." She smiled. "It never did, Dad. You just carried it until the rest of us could hold it too." A week later, Brielle held a staff meeting to announce a major expansion. 5 new cities approved, a national grant secured, and a team of instructors rising from the very students who once trembled on the line. Before leaving the room, she paused. "I have one last announcement," she said, eyes sweeping the group. "Richard Kane has declined all offers to lead the national board." People murmured in surprise. "But he's agreed," she added, smiling softly to keep teaching at Southridge. "Because that's where the heart of this lives." In the back row, Richard just nodded and said, "I'd rather teach 100 quiet shots than give one loud speech." The wind that evening was soft, the kind that rustled the grass in gentle waves and made the leaves whisper secrets to anyone willing to listen. The Southridge Community Center had closed its doors for the day, but out back, under the golden spill of the sinking sun, 3 figures remained. Richard, Lena, and Brielle. No cameras, no crowds, no targets with sponsors' logos or painted rings demanding perfection. Just one wooden stand, weather-worn and bare. 1 arrow each, and all the time in the world. Richard stood a few paces behind the line, the bow in his hand, worn smooth by months of use, but steadier than ever. "Funny," he said softly, looking at the old field. "I used to think everything important happened in arenas. Spotlights. Silence so heavy you could hear your heartbeat in your ears." "And now?" Brielle asked, stepping beside him, her own bow resting gently at her hip. He glanced at Lena, who was fiddling with a tiny GoPro on a tripod she'd set up, just in case we want to remember this. Now, Richard said, I think the best shots happen when no one's watching. Lena turned toward him, smile teasing. Speak for yourself. My 3 TikToks of you hitting flying apples have 1.7 million views, he chuckled. And how many of those people know my name? Does it matter? She asked. He looked down at the arrow in his hand. No, he said. It really doesn't. They took their places. 3 archers, 3 arrows. But no competition. They weren't trying to prove anything. Not anymore. Brielle was the first to shoot. Her stance had improved, no longer rigid, but centered. Stillness replaced tension. Her arrow landed slightly right of center, but her grin was brighter than a bullseye. Progress, she said, lowering the bow. Lena went next. She took her time, narrowing her eyes like she was aiming at more than just wood and straw. She released, and her arrow struck dead center. I drew that one, she joked. In my head, at least. Richard stepped up last. He didn't adjust his feet, didn't measure wind. He just breathed, drew, and whispered, let it stay. The arrow soared. It didn't hit the bullseye. It landed just below Lena's arrow, so close they nearly touched. He lowered the bow and let out a long, slow exhale. They sat in the grass after backs against the same log bench where Lucas once fell asleep after his first class. Lena passed around a thermos of cinnamon tea, and for a while they just watched the sky darken into deepening hues of lavender and blue. I've been thinking, Brielle said eventually, eyes trained on the treetops. Richard raised an eyebrow. Dangerous way to start a sentence. She smirked. I might take a break. He blinked. From Mira Tech, not forever. Just enough to remember who I was before boardrooms and quarterly reports. Lena perked up. What would you even do with free time? Brielle hesitated, then said almost shyly, maybe paint again, or travel. Or who knows, write a book about arrows and redemption. Richard sipped his tea, amused. Don't forget to include the janitor with good aim, front and center, she said. They all laughed. As the stars began to pepper the sky, Lena stood up and walked toward the target. She placed something at its base, small wooden hand-painted, then returned without a word. Richard watched her, curious. What was that? She shrugged, a little sheepish. Just something I made. I wanted to leave it there. He didn't press. But later, after they'd packed up after Brielle had said her goodbyes and driven home with the windows down, Richard returned to the field alone. The moon was out now, casting silver over the grass. He walked to the target. At its base sat a small wooden plaque no bigger than a paperback. On it, Lena had painted a simple scene, 3 arrows mid-flight, curving not toward a ring, but toward a sunrise. And beneath it in her careful cursive were the words, "Sometimes the best shot is not the loudest, but the truest." He picked it up, hands gentle, then knelt and planted it in the soil just below the arrow still resting in the target, not to mark a victory, but to mark a beginning. In the days that followed, life didn't change overnight. Bills still arrived. Some nights, sleep came hard, and not every arrow found its mark. But something had shifted. Richard no longer flinched when people recognized him in grocery stores. Lena continued drawing now with commissions from veteran support groups across the country. Brielle took her sabbatical and sent postcards from national parks with watercolor splashes and updates like shot at 8,000 feet altitude, missed completely. Felt great. And the Aim Forward program grew. Not because it was trendy, but because it was true. One community at a time. One breath at a time. One arrow, released with purpose. Months later, on a quiet spring morning, a new boy stood at the Southridge line, nervous, silent, pale hands gripping a borrowed bow. Richard approached him slowly, gently. First time the boy nodded. "Good," Richard said. Means you haven't forgotten how to be present. He handed the boy an arrow, helped him set his stance, and just before the boy shot, Richard whispered, "Don't worry about the center." The boy blinked. But isn't that the point? Richard smiled. No, the point is that you showed up. As the arrow flew slicing the morning air, Richard stood behind him watching not just where it landed, but what it set in motion. Not the end of a journey, but the arrow that stayed. The one that keeps flying. In all of us. What about you? Where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Just a few words to let us know you're here. If this story touched your heart, and if you'd like to hear more stories, like stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the power of kindness, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. Thank you for spending your time with us today. In a world full of noise, the fact that you stayed until the end means more than we can say. We wish you peace, warmth, and good days ahead. Until next time.